We're in Staunton, Virginia, and I'm sorry for those of you guys who may have tuned in earlier in the day when we were trying to do this from the highway, which totally didn't work. But we're at the Western State Hospital, which is essentially, it was founded in the early 19th century, 1828, here in Virginia, as an Indian asylum. And then during the late 19th century, it expanded greatly, and it operated, I think maybe even the 1980s, and was eventually abandoned. And so you can sort of see it behind me, the building that's boarded. It's a huge campus, thousands of people, and you know, I'm here with a couple of collaborators today, and you can see maybe in the background we each made some heartfelt intentions with materials gathered from here on site. Here I'm here with Dennis the dog, my friend, so he may make a little difference. And so we gathered some materials earlier this morning and here on site, especially because it's coming back from sort of regular landscaping. It's gone back wild, and so we have someone here who has some expertise in ecological development and sort of looking at the different plants and how they're reoccupying the space. And the reason we chose the space for our little hearts behind us was there's like a beautiful little bed of sedum that is like spreading across the grass, and it's this bright spring green. And you know, if you've been following any of the work that my friend Steffers is doing around magenta and sort of the imprinting for the metaverse of magenta, which is a color that's not exactly on the color spectrum chemically, that lime green is sort of an antidote to that. So I wore my lime green today, my spring green, and we've got this beautiful stem. And early on, we were actually talking about plant hybridization and modification, and of course that's now moving into gene editing, both for plants and then in broader context. But even earlier on, the earlier hybridization attempts to create more efficient plants in the way that people thought they needed to be, and the role of Luther Burbank in that, and his work in Los Angeles and his neighbor Yogananda. And one of the things that Luther Burbank was really intent on was coming up with a cactus that didn't have any prickles on it. And I think actually paracactus, but I guess without the prickles. And so as we were walking up the driveway, and again, this is abandoned property and overgrown, and all along the sides were prickly paracactus. So it was just like we were sort of manifesting the cactus of Burbank, but prickles. So we snipped off a couple of the fruit off of the cactus to incorporate into our hearts. And we're here today because in addition to being an institution for people who are deemed insane, this is actually also a central place for the history of eugenics. And if you've been sort of following my work around the Berggruen Institute and California eugenics, and the linking today's approach to human enhancement or longevity enhancement through genetic therapy, through nuclear medicine, that all originated in the eugenics movement of the early 20th century, particularly the 1920s. And a lot of that work happened at Cold Springs Harbor Lab. And there was a gentleman by the name of Harry Laughlin who developed a model eugenic sterilization law. And there was originally a law that passed in Indiana, and it was struck as unconstitutional, but then later there was a follow-up law here in the state of Virginia, and it used Laughlin's model, which is almost like, you know, an Alec Bill Mill model, as the precedent. And then when it was contested in a very famous court case, Buck versus Bell, Carrie Buck being a woman who was forcibly sterilized due to her perceived incompetence, that law was upheld, and that it was within the 14th Amendment, and that it was constitutional. And at that point, I think the law in Virginia was put in place in 1924, and then the court case was in 1927, and the numbers of sterilizations just ramped up to crazy levels. And you know, I know that California was the leader, I think, in terms of the number of men and women who were sterilized. And what I had talked about in some of my writings for the blog is that, you know, 1927, just on the cusp of the Great Depression. And the narrative at the time, and this was led by the scientific elite and the policy elite, was that people who were imbeciles, people who were unable to pull their weight economically, people who had addiction problems, people who had epilepsy, people who had mental health issues, that those were disposable people and that the world would be better off if they could not reproduce. And so that is what allowed the sterilization program. But of course, you know, we're lurching into this fourth industrial revolution of mass automation and dispossession. And, you know, I think there are a lot of lessons we need to look back at this history and understand where it came from, because the Human Betterment Foundation was the West Coast version of Cold Spring Harbor Labs. And among its founding members included, I think it's David Starr Jordan, who was the founding president of Stanford University. So these are premises that were happening at the most elite levels. And so, as we say, trust the science. Well, at one point, the esteemed scientists of the Ivy League were people who would essentially identify whole groups of people as not having the right to exist and to try to erase them from space. And so, and I just brought my little frequency bowl. This is beauty bowl. So my friend first does sort of energy work, and she said, "See, I'm going to just start off with a little." I do this better time. And I forgot to mention, so the other thing is, when we were this morning gathering items, I had a surprise invitation, unexpected but much welcomed, from a friend to come down to the Shenandoah. This is in the Shenandoah Valley of Virginia. And the area that we were staying in, it's called Orkney Springs, or Bayse, B-A-Y-S-E. And there's something called the Bayse Vortex. And in this little sort of valley area, underlying the Shenandoah is what's called a karst rock formation, K-A-R-S-T. And so it's limestone that's percolated with water, and cave formation. So there's lots of natural caves here, and also springs, mineral springs. And even back into the 18th century, this area was known for healing springs and waters. But even actually before the 18th century, indigenous people, the original people on these lands, knew of the healing property of the water, and they were very sacred. So this area around Orkney Springs has been a center of indigenous culture and lifeways and healing for a very long time. And then in the late 19th century, there was a giant hotel sort of built up for people to sort of take the waters, so to speak. And today, of the 7 original springs, there are 2 or 3 that are still functioning, and actually they have pump houses and these beautiful walls, and you can tell that they're very iron enriched, because the little pools that they have with rock work, because this is a mountainous area, there's all this stonework. The water, as it pools, collects the iron, and so it's like bright, rusty orange, which is pretty incredible. And so it's coming out, and it almost creates, like, it almost looks alive, these forms of crystallized iron oxide particulates in the water. And I don't know how many people take the waters these days, but we did pour some on our hands and that sort of thing. And then we went up to what's called Shrine Mont, Shrine, M-O-N-T. And this grand hotel, which is quite beautiful, and you should look it up. It's the largest wooden historic building in the state of Virginia. Enormous and very well kept. It's hard to imagine how it's kept financially, because in addition to the giant hotel, there are numerous cabins and extra buildings and kitchens, and but it's owned by the Archdiocese, the Episcopal Archdiocese of Virginia. And, you know, the interesting thing about this, so they acquired it, I think, in maybe the 70s, but many Anglicans would go to this hotel and had connections to that particular location on the mountain before the Anglicans actually acquired the property. And in 1925, August 6th of 1925, they consecrated an open-air chapel called the Cathedral of the Transfiguration. And for me, that really jumps out, because when we went to the Mormon Transhumanist Conference, a lot of this human plus next level of evolution is connected to the idea of transfiguring, metamorphosis. And I don't know if you can hear behind me, there's all these beautiful cicadas. So we have the song of the cicada, which is also about metamorphosis. And one of my friends who was here when we were gathering findings found a beautiful snakeskin shed, maybe a black snake. And so we placed that in. So that is, again, but it's a natural transformation, right? Not a transformation through nanotechnology and frequency. And so we visited last night, and the interesting thing about this chapel is it's open air. There's no roof. It's like a grotto. The altar, it's all bouldered stonework. A grotto with an altar, a small bell tower, a little ancillary building that looks like it maybe has an organ in it. And then there's a baptismal font that's just to one side of the altar and not too far under the bell tower, like in alignment, just a bit off. And what's kind of amazing about this baptismal font, it's maybe 3 feet across or so, and it has this basin in it that's maybe the size of a basketball, that sort of size. And last night it was full of water. It was beautiful. You could see the reflection in the water. It's actually, according to history, it's an indigenous corn grinding bowl. So this is the Anglican Church, the Church of England, that in Virginia was the state religion of Virginia from 1607, which is Jamestown settlement, to 1789, when finally they said, no, you can't actually have a state religion anymore. You have to open it up to other religions. They have a really close hold on the state of, on Virginia, on that region. And so, and again, the Church of England was established by Elizabeth I, and her consultant on all things, many things, was the mathematician, alchemist, astronomer, astrologer, philosopher John Dee. And John Dee was very much focused on creating this new continent, expanding the British Empire onto the new world. And that's, Jamestown was part of that plan. So to me, it's really interesting, especially if you know that corn culture is really central to the New World, and manipulation of corn through genetic modification, now including the seeds that kill themselves after one season, and that's so integrated, Monsanto and Syngenta, control of the natural, naturally caused access for huge numbers of people around the world, in the name of improvement, right? That Maya considered themselves the corn people of the corn, and their cosmology was that the first man and the first woman were made from cornmeal flour. And so to me, in this space, sort of the desecration of indigenous plant materials, including sacred tobacco, including the corn, and then taken into the domination imperial program, feels really central, and that it's ongoing over time, and that the eugenics movement that is evidenced by the buildings behind me, and the work that I've been doing in California, it's this sense that life is simply can be distilled to a molecule, can be engineered, can be governed, right, by humans. And the one thing that was really interesting to me today is when we went back this morning to gather some more materials, and I got, boxwood, which is quintessentially, actually John Bartram sent, I think, the boxwood to Great Britain, but it's part of those 18th century gardens, and sassafras, which is a medicinal plant, and some other things. But we looked on the altar, and between last night and this morning, there were books of common prayer laid out on the altar. And when I looked, one of the books actually had ribbon bookmarks. And me, like, I'm a sucker. I'm like, okay, so what pages are marked here, right? And the Book of Common Prayer was sort of, again, established in the Church of England as every day you would sort of lay out the prayer structure of the year. One of the tabs documented August 6th, which had happened recently, I think, like last week or so, and there was a celebration of the anniversary of the creation of this Cathedral. And then the other was 33. And Psalm 33 is all about essentially singing a song to God, the cicadas, right? And the frequency, and playing the harp and the lyre and the trumpets, and that like the will of the Lord prevails over time, and that like man can't overcome the horse that created the universe. And to me, and again, 33 is a significant number, but that felt really intentional and relevant to today's enterprise. So I also have this book that I was trying to read in the car, and I'm not going to read the whole thing because it's 60 pages, but it's pretty short, and I would suggest that this might be worthwhile looking into. It was written by J.D. Bernal, and he was a pioneer in X-ray crystallography. Now, before we came out here, we were actually at a museum of Walter Russell, and Walter Russell was a polymath, I guess, a guy from Nova Scotia with a 4th grade education who, by way of Boston, became a very well-networked artist and sculptor, painting portraits and creating busts of many well-connected people, including, I guess he was the official sculptor of the White House under FDR and did many busts of Franklin Delano Roosevelt. But at some point in his older life, he had an energetic mystical experience that went on for like 30 days where he was essentially sort of shown the structure of the universe. And so a lot of it was about optics and scientific drawings, and it's quite fascinating. And he and his wife Lau moved to Swannanoa at some point, 1948, to this estate, and renovated it and created this whole school that was also a correspondence course for understanding these theories of frequency and gravity and various kind of energetics, light. Which again, there's a lot having to do with photonics. And I will say, from who sent me the beautiful dandelions and the note in the bottom of the tea box of the dandelions. We've left your note and your intention in one of the hearts, and actually part that was made by someone else who has ties to Rochester. So it was very serendipitous that way. So there's this sense of this energetic transformation that goes way back, and these are people who are well connected and very serious. The general public is not aware of this information, and I'm just going to read a little bit from this book because I think it will put into context. I'm going to read about 10 pages. So if those of you who have listened to my read alouds, this isn't quite as sweet as Tuck Everlasting or A Wrinkle in Time, but I think it's important for us to know. This person, Bernal, in addition to being a pioneer in structural crystallography, he had the first chair in structural crystallography at Cambridge, and then he went to work at University College London, and he was a scientific advisor to Lord Mountbatten in World War II. So very well-connected guy, very interested in the origins of life. He did work into cholesterol or olestrins and proteins, and examining the structure of water and meteorites, and really trying to figure out how life worked and where it came from. And I think we're all interested in that, but I think there are increasing numbers of people who are still working under this eugenic form of domination, who want to take control from God of the molecules and push us into this new empire, which is the metaverse. And I will just say, you can't see it, but just down the hill from us over there, right next to the highway, with so much truck traffic, 81 is the truck traffic corridor, is the Frontier Museum, right? And so it's all of these Frontier, Virginia historic log buildings that have been moved next to the highway. And I think that is sort of the echo, the drone of the highway traffic of empire, right? And as there are attempts to drag us into this militarized frequency zone, there are some of us who are sitting here with little sound bowls and natural materials and channeling the lime green of these lovely little succulents, and holding on to the real. So, with no further ado, this is from J.D. Bernal. The flesh. In the alteration of himself, man has a great deal further to go than in the alteration of his inorganic environment. He has been doing the latter more or less unconsciously and empirically for several thousand years, ever since he, I think, ceased being parasitic on his environment, like any other animal, and consciously and intelligently for at least hundreds of years, whereas he had not been able to change himself at all and has had only 50 years or so to begin to understand how he works. Now, this book is from 1929. That's an important thing to remember. It was reprinted by Verso more recently, but it's a 1929 book. Of course, this is not strictly true. Man has altered himself in the evolutionary process. He has lost a good deal of hair, his wisdom teeth are failing to pierce, and his nasal passages are becoming more and more degenerate. But the process of natural evolution are so much slower than the development of man's control over the environment that we might, in such a developing world, still consider man's body as constant and unchanging. If it is not so, then man himself must actively interfere in his own making and interfere in a highly unnatural manner. The eugenicists and apostles of healthy life may, in a very considerable course of time, realize the full potentialities of the species. We may count on beautiful, healthy, and long-lived men and women, but they do not touch the alteration of the species. To do this, we must either alter the germplasm of the living structure of the body, or both together. The first method, the favorite of Mr. J.B.S. Haldane, has so far received the most attention. With it, we might achieve such a variation as we have empirically produced in dogs and goldfish, or perhaps even manage to produce a new species with special potentialities for grew work. But the method is bound to be slow and finally limited by the possibilities of flesh and blood. The germplasm is a very inaccessible unit. Before we can deal with it adequately, we must isolate it, and to do this already involves us in surgery. It is quite conceivable that the mechanism of evolution, as we know it up to present, may well be superseded at this point. Biologists are apt, even if they are not vitalists, to consider it almost divine. But after all, it is only nature's way of achieving a shifting equilibrium with an environment. And if we can find a more direct way by use of intelligence, that way is bound to supersede the unconscious mechanism of growth and reproduction. In a sense, we have already started using the direct method. When the ape ancestor first used a stone, he was modifying his bodily structure by the inclusion of a foreign substance. This inclusion was temporary, but with the adoption of clothes, there began a series of permanent additions to the body, affecting nearly all of its functions, and even, as with spectacles, its sense organs. In the modern world, the variety of objects which really form a part of an effective human body is very great. Yet they all, if we accept such rarities as artificial larynges, still have the quality of being outside the cell layers of the human body. The next decisive step will come when we extend the foreign body into the actual structure of living matter. Parallel with this development is the alteration of the body by tampering with its chemical reactions. Again, a very old established but rather sporadic process resorted to cure illness or procure intoxication. Surgery on the one hand and physiological chemistry on the other, the possibility of radical alteration of the body appears for the first time. Here may proceed by allowing evolution to work changes, but by copying and short-circuiting its methods. The change evolution produces, apart from mere growth in size or diversity of form, without changing of function, are in the nature of perversions. A part of the fish's gut becomes a swimming bladder. The swimming bladder becomes a lung, and an eye are charged with the function of producing hormones. Under the pressure of environment, or whatever else is the cause of evolution, nature takes hold of what had already existed for some superseded activity, and with a minimum of alteration gives it a new function. There is nothing essentially mysterious in the process. It is both the easiest and only possible way of achieving the change. Starting de novo to deal with a new situation is not within the power of natural, unintelligent processes. They can only modify in a limited way already existing structures by altering the chemical environment. Men may well copy the process insofar as original structures are used as the basis for new ones, simply because it is the most economical method, but they are not bound to the very limited range of methods of change which nature adopts. Now, modern mechanical and modern chemical discoveries have rendered both the skeletal and metabolic functions of the body to a large extent useless. In teleological biochemistry, one might say that an animal moves his limbs in order to get his food and uses his body organs in order to turn that food into blood to keep his body alive and active. Now, if a man is only an animal, this is all very satisfactory. But viewed from the standpoint of mental activity by which he increasingly lives, it is a highly inefficient way of keeping his mind working. In a civilized worker, the limbs are mere parasites, demanding 9/10 of the energy of the food and even a kind of blackmail in the exercise they need to prevent disease, while the bodily organs wear themselves out in supplying the requirements. On the other hand, the increasing complexity of man's existence, particularly the mental capacity required to deal with its mechanical and physical complications, gives rise to the need for a much more complex sensory and motor organization, and even more fundamentally, for a better organized cerebral mechanism. Sooner or later, the useless parts of the body must be given modern functions or dispensed with altogether. And in their place, we must incorporate in the effective body the mechanisms and functions. Surgery and chemistry science is still too young to predict exactly how it will happen. The account I'm about to give must rather as a fable. The perfect man, remember, eugenics, the perfect man. Such as the doctors, the eugenicists, and the public health officers between them hope to make of humanity. Okay, so I forgot to say, so the guy who is like the force behind the forced sterilization and the expansion of this, his name was Joseph DeJarnette. And he came from a very well-established Virginia family, I think French Huguenot plantation owners, and he came from a military background. And at the time, in the early 1930s, when the Nazis had picked up our eugenics model legislation and were pursuing it, and that was pursued in advance of the genocide in the gas chambers, he was like quoted as saying, like, the Nazis are beating us at our own game, like we really need to hustle, folks, and like ramp up this eugenics program, right? And so where is this coming from? This book is in the same era, 1929. So talking about essentially jettisoning large parts of our body and mental function to upgrade to the next thing that doesn't require material reality. Okay, so to take as a starting point, the perfect man, such as the doctors, the eugenicists, and the public health officers between them, hope to make of humanity a man living perhaps an average of 120 years, but still mortal, and increasingly feeling the burden of this mortality. Already Shaw, in his mystical fashion, cries out for life, to give us hundreds of years to experience, learn, and understand. But without the vitalist faith in the efficacy of the human will, we shall have to resort to some artifice in order to achieve this purpose. Sooner or later, some eminent physiologist will have his neck broken in a super-civilized accident, or find his body cells worn beyond capacity for repair, and he will then be forced to decide whether to abandon his body or his life. After all, it is the brain that counts, and to have a brain suffused by fresh and correctly prescribed blood is to be alive and to think. The experiment is not impossible. It has already been performed on a dog, and is 3/4 of the way towards achieving it with a human subject. Only a Brahmin philosopher would care to exist as an isolated brain, but perpetually centered on its own meditations. Permanently to break off all communication with the world is as good as to be dead. However, the channels of communication are ready at hand. Already we know the essential electrical nature of nerve impulses. It is a matter of delicate surgery to attach nerves permanently to apparatus which will either send messages to the nerves or receive them. And the brain, thus connected up, continues an existence purely mental and with very different delights from those of the body, but even now perhaps preferable to complete extinction. The example may have been too far-fetched, perhaps. The same result may be achieved much more gradually and by use of many superfluous nerves with which our body is endowed for various auxiliary and motor services. We have ecosystem services and motor services, right? We badly need a small sense organ for detecting wireless frequencies. This is 1929. We need eyes for infrared, ultraviolet, and X-rays. We need ears for supersonics, detectors of high and low temperatures, of electrical potential and current, and chemical organs of many kinds. We may perhaps be able to train a great number of hot and cold and pain-receiving nerves to take over these functions. On the motor side, we shall soon be, if not already, obliged to control mechanisms for which 2 hands and feet are an entirely inadequate number. And apart from that, direction of mechanism by pure volition would enormously simplify its operation. Where the motor mechanism is not primarily electrical, it might be simpler and more effective to use nerve muscle preparations instead of direct connections. Even the pain nerves may be pressed into service to report any failure in the associated mechanism. A mechanical stage utilizing some or all alteration of the body form might, in initial experiments were successful in the sense of leading to a tolerable existence, become the regular culmination to ordinary life. Can you imagine? Okay, trust the science. The mechanical stage. Whether this should ever be so for the whole of the population, well, we will discuss that later. But for the moment, we may attempt to picture what would be, at this period, the course of existence for a transformable human being. Starting as Mr. J. B. S. Haldane so convincingly predicts, in an ectogenetic factory, man will have anything from 60 to 120 years of larval, unspecialized existence. Surely enough to satisfy the advocates of a natural life. In this stage, he need not be cursed by the age of science and mechanism, but he can occupy his time without the conscience of wasting it in dancing, poetry, and lovemaking, and perhaps incidentally take part in the reproductive activity. And then he will leave the potentiality he should have sufficiently explored. The next stage to that of a chrysalis, a complicated and rather unpleasant process of transforming the already existing organs and grafting on all the new sensory and motor mechanisms. And there would follow a period of re-education in which he would grow to understand the functioning of his new sensory organs and practice the manipulation of his new motor mechanism. And finally, he would emerge as a completely effective, mentally directed mechanism and set about the tasks appropriate to his new capacities. But this is by no means the end of his development, although it marks his last great metamorphosis. Apart from such mental development his increased faculties will demand from him, he will be physically plastic in a way quite transcending the capabilities of the untransformed humanity. Should he need a new sense organ or have a new mechanism to operate, he will have undifferentiated nerve connections to attach them and will be able to extend indefinitely his possible sensations and actions by using successfully different end organs. The carrying out of these complicated surgical and physiological operations would be in the hands of a medical profession, which would be bound to come rapidly together under the control of transformed men. Oh my gosh. Like, if modern medicine isn't enough, like, imagine Rockefeller medicine with transformed men with micro appendages. Okay. The operations themselves would probably be conducted by mechanisms controlled by the transformed heads of the profession. Though in the earlier and experimental stages, of course, it would still be done by human surgeons and physiologists. I love you, cicadas. This is so awesome. They're getting loud. That's frequency. Okay, it is much more difficult to form a picture of the final state, partly because this final state would be so fluid and liable to improve, and partly because there would be no reason whatever why all people should transform in the same way. Probably a great number of typical forms would be developed, and each specialized in a certain direction. Yeah, this book influenced Brave New World, by the way, Aldous Huxley's. It came out in 1932. So you've got all of the alpha, beta people, right? If we confine ourselves to what might be called the first stage of mechanized humanity and to a person mechanized for scientific rather than aesthetic purposes, for to predict even the shapes that men would adopt if they were to make themselves a harmony of form and sensation must be beyond all imagination. Then the description might run roughly as follows. Instead of the present body structure, we should have the whole framework of some very rigid material. Probably not metal, but one of the new fibrous substances. In the shape, it might well be rather a short cylinder. And inside the cylinder, and supported very carefully to prevent shock, is the brain with its nerve connections. Immersed in a fluid of the nature of cerebrospinal fluid, kept circulating over at a uniform temperature. And the brain and nerve cells are kept supplied with fresh oxygenated blood and drained of deoxygenated blood through their arteries and veins, which will connect outside the cylinder to an artificial heart-lung digestive system, an elaborate automatic contrivance. Now, I will just say, I'm pretty sure, and people can correct me on this if I'm wrong, but the heart-lung thing, that like the head of, I think the former head of the LDS church was a heart surgeon and involved, like, no, he's a heart surgeon, but also the first artificial heart was, I think, developed in Salt Lake City. You can correct me if I'm wrong, look it up, but I'm pretty sure there's something about artificial hearts and the Salt Lake City region and LDS church. So yeah, heart and lung machine. Okay. So this might in large part be made from living organs. That's kind of like Suzanne Gildert, right? Like hybrid things. From living organs, although these would have to be carefully arranged so that no failure on their part would endanger the blood supply to the brain. Only a fraction of the body's present requirements, and so that they could be interchanged and repaired without disturbing functions. And the brain, thus guaranteed continuous awareness, is connected in the anterior of the case with its immediate sense organs, the eye and the ear. Eyes will look into a kind of optical box, which will enable them to alternately look into periscopes, project from the case, telescopes, microscopes, a whole range of televisual apparatus. And the ear would have the corresponding microphone attachment and would still be the chief organ for wireless reception. Smell and taste organs, on the other hand, would be prolonged into connections outside the case and would be changed into chemical tasting organs, achieving a more conscious and less pure emotional role than they have at present. It may perhaps be impossible to do this owing to the particularly close relationship between the brain and the olfactory organs, in which case the remaining sensory nerve, position, and visceral functioning would go to the corresponding organs. Attached to the brain cylinder would be immediate corresponding, but to a much more complex than our mouth, lungs, and hands. This new system would probably be like that of a crustacean, which uses the same general type for antenna, jaw, and limb, and they would range from delicate micro-manipulators to levers capable of exerting considerable forces, all controlled by the appropriate motor nerves. I mean, this really makes me think of all the predictive programming of like the Transformers, like all of the Transformer like cartoons that the kids are used to, right? Like, here, you can be a crustacean and have super grip, you know? All of the Marvel superheroes are sort of prepping us for this, right? Superhero powers that we're supposed to, yeah, aspire to be a brain in a box. Closely associated with brain case would be sound, color, wireless producing organs. In addition to these, there would be certain types of organs of a type we do not possess at present. They would be self-repairing, which under the control of the brain would be able to manipulate the other organs, particularly the visceral blood supply, and to keep them in effective working order. Serious derangements, such as those involving loss of consciousness, would still, of course, call for outside assistance, but with proper care, these would be the nature of rare accidents. The remaining organs would have a more temporary connection with the brain case. There would be locomotor apparatuses of different kinds, which could be used alternatively for slow movement, equivalent to walking, for rapid transit, and for flight. On the whole, however, the locomotor organs would not be much used because the extension of the sense organs would tend to take their place. Most of these would be mere mechanisms quite apart from the body. There would be sending parts of the television apparatus, teleacoustic and telechemical organs, and telesensory organs of the nature of touch for determining all forms of textures. Now that's haptics, folks. That's totally haptics. Besides these, okay, these extended organs would only belong in a loose sense to any particular person, or rather they would belong only temporarily to the person who was using them and could equivalently be operated by other people. This capacity for independence might depend relative fixity for brains, and this would in itself advance from the point of view of security and uniformity of conditions. Only some of the more active considering it necessary to be on the spot to observe and do things. Let me see. Okay, I've got like 5 more pages. The new man must appear to be those who have not contemplated him before as a strange, monstrous, and inhuman creature, but he is only the logical outcome of the type of humanity that exists as present. Right? Like, let me just read that again. The new man must appear to those who have not contemplated him before as a strange, monstrous, and inhuman creature, but he is only the logical outcome of the type of humanity that exists at present. He is the only logical outcome of the type of humanity that exists right now. And it may be argued that this tampering with mechanism is as unnecessary and difficult that all of the increase of control needed may be obtained by an extremely responsive mechanisms outside possible at the early stages, a surgically transformed of a normal man. Although it is possible that man has far to go before his inherent physiological and psychological makeup becomes the limiting factor to his development, this must happen sooner or later, and it is then that the mechanized man will begin to show a definite advantage. Normal man is an evolutionary dead end. Mechanical man, apparently a break in organic evolution, actually more in the true tradition of further evolution. Okay, so they're saying people are a dead end. A much more fundamental break is implicit in the means of his development. If a method has been found of connecting a nerve ending in the brain directly with an electrical reactor, then the way is opening for connecting it with the brain cell of another person. Okay, so that's hive mind. Such a connection, being of course essentially electrical, could be effected just as well through the ether as along wires. Okay, so that's etheric connection. At first, this would limit itself to the more perfect and economic transference of thought, which would be necessary in the cooperative thinking of the future. But it can't stop here. Connections between two or more minds would tend to become a more and more permanent condition until they functioned as a dual or multiple organism. And that's Melanie Swan's quantum computer brain-computer interfaces, the quantum blockchain brains that she's talking about, the collective consciousness. The nerve operating on smart tracks. Minds would always preserve a certain individuality, the network of cells inside the brain being more dense than existing, chiefly occupied with mental development and only communicating with the uncommon purpose. Once the more or less permanent compound brain existence, two of the molecular limitations of present existence would be surmounted. In the first place, death would be on a different and far less terrible aspect. Death would still exist for the mentally directed mechanism we have just described, postponed for 300 or perhaps 1,000 years, as long as the brain cells could be persuaded to live in the most favorable environment, but not forever. Now that's the blockchain mind files ledger. But the multiple individual would, by cataclysmic accidents, immortal, as they newer ones, without losing the continuity of the self, the memories and feelings of the old member, transferring themselves almost completely to the common stock before death. And if this seems only a way of cheating death, we must realize that the individual brain will feel itself part of the whole in a way that completely transcends the devotion of the most fanatical adherent of a religious sect. It is really difficult to imagine. It would be a state of ecstasy in the literal sense, and in the second great alteration that the compound mind makes possible. Whatever the intensity feeling ever we may strive to reach ourselves into another's mind, we are barred by the limitations of our individuality. Here, at least, those barriers would be down. Feeling would truly communicate itself. Memories would be held. Sorry, hanging out with me. Memories would be held in common, and in all this identity and continuity of individual lives. Probably, the different individual compound mind would not all have to function of the same rank of importance, of course. Division of labor would soon set in. Some mind might be the task of ensuring the proper functioning of the others. Some might specialize in sense reception, and so on, and thus would grow up a hierarchy of minds that would be more truly a complex than compound mind. The complex, with their lease of life, extend their perceptions and understanding and their actions far beyond those of the individual. Time senses could be altered. The events that moved with the slowness of geological ages would be apprehended as movement. At the same time, rapid vibrations of the physical world would be separated. As we have seen, sense organs would tend to be less and less attached to bodies, the host of the subsidiary. Purely mechanical agents and receptors are capable of penetrating those regions where organic bodies cannot enter or to survive. The outer part. The interior and the cells of living themselves would be open to consciousness through these angels. And through these angels, that's interesting because we saw angels, the 4 freedoms, the freedom from your body, the FDR 4 freedom statue. The angel, Walter Russell developed these angels 4 freedom statues. So the angels of beyond. The interior of the earth and the stars, okay, the innermost cells, whatever. Okay, so the angels would be open to consciousness, and through them, also the motions of the stars and the living things could be directed. That's interesting. They're in charge. Okay, so talk to God and nature about that. This is enough beyond that it must direct itself. Yet why should we stop until our imaginations are exhausted? Mr. Bernal, you should have stopped already. Even beyond this, there are foreseeable possibilities. Undoubtedly, the nature of life processes themselves will be far more intensively studied. To make life itself will be only a preliminary stage, because in its simplest phases, life can differ very little from the inorganic world. But the mere making of life would only be important if we intended to allow it to evolve itself anew. This, as Mr. White suggests in Archimedes, is necessarily a lengthy process, but there is no need to wait for it. Instead, artificial life would undoubtedly be used as ancillary to human activity and not allowed to evolve except for experimental purposes. Men will not be content to manufacture life. They will want to improve on it. True. For one material out of which nature has been forced to make life, man will have 1,000. Living organized material will be as much at the call of the mechanized or compound man as metals are today. That's what the Berggruen Institute is all about, is the biochemistry, pull everything apart and putting it together and implementation. And this living material will come to such inferior functions of the brain as memory, reflex, actions, etc. And in the compound man himself, for bodies at this time would be left far behind. The brain itself would become more and more separated into different groups of cells or individual cells with complicated connections, probably occupying considerable space. And this would mean loss of mobility, which would be owing to the extension of the sense faculties. Every part would not be accessible for replacing or repairing, and this would in itself ensure a practical eternity of existence. For even the replacement of a previously organic brain cell by a synthetic apparatus would not destroy the continuity of consciousness. The new life would be more plastic, more directly controllable. That's what we need, more control. And at the same time, more variable and more permanent than that produced by the triumphant opportunism of nature. Bit by bit, the heritage of direct line of mankind, the heritage of the original life emerging on the face of the world would dwindle, and in the end, disappear, effectively being preserved, perhaps as some curious relic, while the new life, which conserves none of the substance and all of the spirit of the old, would take its place and continue its development. And that feels very much like the Mormon Transhumanist Conference. Such a change would be as important as that which in life first appeared on the Earth's surface and might be as gradual and imperceptible. Finally, consciousness itself may end or vanish in a humanity that has become completely etherealized, losing the close-knit organism, becoming masses of atoms in space, communicating by radiation, radioactive communication, and ultimately perhaps resolving itself entirely into light. Now, I need to talk to you about this more later, but the Quakers call themselves children of the light. And there's a lot connected to Penn and the Quakers in this gene modifying program, and Ben Franklin and his electricity. That may be an end or a beginning, but from here it is out of sight. And I know that that's not like the easiest reading, but I think I don't think many people even know about Bernal, what his role was, his influence. I mean, I think we can listen to that and imagine that it's a lot like the Matrix. And again, and maybe I'm seeing patterns that aren't quite there, but this was a very fortuitous trip, serendipitous trip. The fact that, you know, my friend who invited me was not necessarily aware of all the backstory of Shrinemont and the springs and this basin and the Church of England and Elizabeth I and John Dee and the creation of empire in America as this next level of empire, and really Silicon Valley and like the atom bombs and the Cold War and the radioeugenics programs being carried out through the radioactive isotopes of the Atomic Energy Commission, and both the ecology and the human and the corn and the seeds and it infesting and tentaclizing in everything, and that's embedded in the culture of the United States, but the colonial architecture of it going back to Jamestown, and that this new empire, right, is the metaverse and is in a sense going to be photonic, right? That is, it can't happen fast enough in electronics. It needs to move to optics and photonics. And so the idea of it all of this communication happening through radioactive waves and light, like maybe that's the metaverse that is planned. And it's an outright military project. It's a project of domination, just like the bell tower hangs over the basin with the corn. So, here. So I'm kind of plugged. So I'm going to unplug myself and just like the last little bit, I'm going to do my bowl, and from the spring, the Bear Wallow Spring, I think, it feeds into this little lakey pond area, and there were all of these cattails. And I have to say, like, where I'm at in Philadelphia, a lot of the wetland areas are overrun with Phragmites, and there's not a lot of cattails. So it's really lovely to see a whole gathering of cattails. And I often reference Robin Wolkimmer's work, and she, she's the indigenous biologist at the SUNY Forestry School, and she does a field school, or used to in the summer, where they would take the students out into the lakes and look at nature and all of the bounty of nature. And one of the central things they talk about were all of the things that indigenous people took from the cattails. And so the other day when we were at the pond, I was just sprinkling them, and they were just floating like these beautiful particles, like the not nanoparticle. And so in the spirit of the inherent indigenous of Mother Nature and the Creator and God in the universe, against the abomination, the monstrous abomination that I just read about by Bernal, I'm going to just sprinkle some of these over our heart, and then close out. Pardon me. I don't know if you can see me. I have my little thing on, so. Can you see me? Am I in the picture? Mm-hmm. This one is slightly waterlogged. You can hold it up. Yeah, that's fine. Thank you, Sharon. Dennis in the sun. Thinks it might be tasty. They're not going to capture this. They can't put this in a box. We don't consent to any of this, and we're going to transmute these misguided intentions. If this is a lunatic, if this was what they call a lunatic asylum, it is the sciences that are is the lunacy, and so maybe we need to get in touch with the actual moon again, and not with our beingness. So thanks for following along. I hope you understand why the eugenics program is important and why we need to have the broader conversation, just not to dip into the genocide aspect, because that's something that, I think that there is an erasure component, and I think that there's a lot that is connected to indigenous erasure of connection to the natural source and cycles. That is part of it. But what they're trying to do is to use us as a canvas for an engineering project that we didn't consent to. And it has a history. It came from somewhere. And it didn't come from out there. It came from Cold Springs Harbor Lab on Long Island. And it came from Virginia, right? It came from plantation culture, right? And domination culture. And a lot of it is masquerading as faith, but I would say, like, again, if you take Psalm 33 to heart, which is what the message was for me today, is that God is above all of this. Like, people's misguided intentions. You can play at being God, but you're not God, and we need to have proper respect, both for nature and for one another, and the Human Plus program that's coming is not the answer. The answer is lime green. Oh, and the last thing. So we have a bottle of water that we got from the spring, and I forgot to, so I'm going to pour a little bit of water around our hearts just to finish it off. So that's what I'm going to do next, and that'll be my last thing. Lime green. So this is from Bear Wallow Spring. Transmute eugenics. Transmute eugenics. Transmute domination. Transmute domination. Trust nature. Trust nature. It's sacred. Thanks for watching, everybody. Thanks for hanging with us. All right, bye-bye. I don't know how to end it. Do I end it? No? No? I don't know how to end it. Oh, nope. Wait. I don't know how to stop. I don't know how to stop this. Sorry. Save highlight cancel. Oh, maybe I just do that. Oh, yeah.